Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. John Brentar. He is from Morrissey Compton, and he's joining me. I'm Marley. I'm on staff here at PHP. We have decided to do this partnership with Morrissey Compton. They are well-respected leaders here in the Bay Area in assessing children, youth, and adults who have learning challenges, as well as attention disorders and some mental health issues.
Right.
So he will be talking about assessments. I want to let you know that you can ask questions via the Q&A box on Zoom, and I will hold the questions till the end, and I'll come back and we will talk about them at the end. So the presentation will be about 50 minutes, and then we'll get into Q&A. So, okay, with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. John Brentar, who is a licensed psychologist. He's been at Morrissey Compton as the executive director since 2006. He brings a wealth of knowledge about all the subject matter related to kids and learning disabilities and ADHD. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to John. Thank you, John.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be talking about assessments. It's a major part of my clinical work, and I've been doing them for about 30 some years. And I've worked with kids from 4 or 5-year-olds to adults, including some adults in their 40s or 50s. We'll talk about some of that a little bit later. But this presentation is an evaluation for your child or student. So we will be answering or addressing the following questions. What are the warning signs of learning challenges? When should I seek a consultation with an educational or mental health professional about whether an evaluation is warranted? When is the best time to have my student evaluated? Who should perform the evaluation? How do I prepare my students for the evaluation? What happens during the evaluation from intake to parent conference? What should you do with the results of the evaluation? And does my student ever need to be reevaluated? So we'll address that, essentially the process of beginning from when you're considering evaluation to the end and follow-up. So at Morrissey Compton, we find that we have 3 age groups that tend to be our greatest proportion of referrals. First, we tend to see a lot of 8 to 9-year-olds, which most of those students are 3rd to 4th grade. So they're dealing with greater homework demands. They're moving from learning to read to reading to learn, greater demands for writing, and difficulty with math facts or retrieving mathematical procedures. So that's probably our number 1 age group of students who come in, because they've been able to kind of keep it together in 1st and 2nd grade. Then with homework and these greater academic demands, things start to really show up. The second age group, we tend to see a lot of referrals are 11 to 12-year-olds, and those are students who are transitioning to middle school, where there's greater demand for organization, managing time, first time that they're managing multiple teachers. And then the next is 14 to 15-year-olds when they're transitioning to high school and greater demands for executive functioning skills. Often we see in that age group, those are brighter students who probably weren't, who are able to make it through elementary and middle school okay, but then as they're starting to deal with advanced academics, particularly like AP classes, those sorts of things, issues around reading, writing, attention show up more. So we do see students as young as 5 years old coming for an evaluation. And some of the early warning signs we see in that early age group or the young age group are early challenges with reading. So let's say that parents have been, you as parents have been doing a lot of reading with your child, and he or she's not seeming to pick it up, or even sort of memorizing the words if you're reading the same story repeatedly, having trouble counting, remembering the names of colors, remembering the alphabet and the correct sequence, and even remembering the days of the week. They might have difficulty with rhyming, like if you're looking at poems or rhyming stories like Dr. Seuss, they may have trouble with that. difficulty recognizing letters in their name, so they may have trouble writing their name even if they've been taught to do that. A family history of dyslexia, which often raises and parents' antennas to look for early signs, and then hyperactivity and attention distractibility or behavioral challenges. So those are the children who are having trouble managing behavior in the classroom. The outcomes when you're testing a young child like that is it's hard to make a diagnosis. We can talk about, that there are early warning signs of dyslexia. There seem to be indicators of ADHD. Sometimes the problems are very clear cut, and we are able to make a diagnosis. But when you think about that, the child hasn't really had exposure to academic work or intervention, we often take what's referred to as a response to intervention approach. And so we want to see, will your child respond to some kind of early intervention, tutoring, educational therapy service? So if your child does respond and picks up reading very easily or spelling, it suggests that the concerns might have been developmental, that your child is maybe a late bloomer and not necessarily a learning disorder. But for children with significant challenges, like either significant behavioral challenges or attention challenges or really significant learning challenges, you might want to consider placement in a private school with a specialized curriculum. So, for example, like a Charles Armstrong school or Athena Academy or Sandhill School, which work with kids with dyslexia, or a school that's perhaps more structured for kids with behavioral problems. We also see adults. We tend to see a fair number of college or graduate students who suspect some kind of a learning disorder, ADHD. And those are often students who come to us after they've had their first semester of college and they're finding themselves really struggling with the academics. What we tend to find is a lot of those students deal with executive functioning issues. They may have inattentive ADHD, which was missed because if you're dealing with ADHD, the inattentive form, that's more of an internalized condition. So it's not the symptoms aren't readily apparent to others. And then some of the students have had previous diagnoses in early childhood of dyslexia or dysgraphia. And then, they were using technology and other supports and sort of didn't think that they still needed those kinds of help. We see that a lot in graduate students. For example, I remember seeing a graduate student who was at the business school at Stanford. He returned as a 33-year-old, and he was working in the banking field after graduation from college. He went to a specialized school for dyslexia on the East Coast, and he developed a lot of techniques and strategies to help, but they were specific to his job performance. And so now when he got back to school and started seeing or having to deal with heavy-duty reading assignments, he began to realize, this is still there. So a student like that might come in for an evaluation. Sometimes we have parents or just adults who suspect they may have an undiagnosed learning disorder, ADHD. Maybe there's job performance issues or relationship issues, so they ask for an evaluation. And we get a fair number of parents who actually seek their own evaluation after we've gone through the results with them for their child, and they begin to recognize the very similar patterns in them. And some parents do it because they want to sort of understand what their child's experience is like, and others is just for self-knowledge and to help manage and develop strategies and techniques to manage their responsibilities, whether it's managing home, managing job, managing a business. So what are some of the common signs of learning disorders? These are the sort of typical signs that kids show when they come in for evaluation. Problems with reading, obviously, is one of the big reasons students are referred for testing. We find some have trouble sounding out words. They may have weak sound symbol associations. So, for example, when they see the letter K. They don't necessarily pair it with the K sound, which is important when it comes to reading and sounding out words. A very common issue we see is parents say, we worked on a word yesterday, but then when it was in context and it was part of a reading assignment the next day, the child stumbled over it, or they may read the word differently in the same paragraph. We also see, of course, weak comprehension, that kids don't remember what they're reading or don't understand sort of more of the analytical aspects in older students. Problems with writing, we have students with trouble getting started on writing assignments. There's poor spelling. There's weak penmanship. And weak penmanship often creates challenges for students to express themselves in written form. And so often their written expression doesn't match their oral expression. And so when you ask them to write a sentence, they tend to be fairly short and concrete. Problems with math. Some students don't understand concepts of math. Some have problems with attending to the operational sign. For younger kids, it's often difficulty mastering math facts. That's usually a sign of some retrieval challenges. And often a lot of dyslexic students have trouble with math facts as well, although we do see students who have trouble with math and are good readers or writers. We see students coming in with challenges about poor memory, and that can manifest as poor test performance, so that they appear to study for exams but don't remember them the next day. Challenges with processing and remembering multi-step directives, those kinds of things. Obviously, problems paying attention is a big concern for a lot of kids who are coming in for ADHD evaluations. Trouble following directions, as I mentioned, multi-step directions, or even simple one-step directions. Trouble telling time on an analog clock, which we don't, more and more they're kind of going out of business. So most kids are relying on digital clock, but trouble reading an analog clock can indicate some visual spatial problems staying organized, especially as students get older, poor pencil grip or illegible writing. And those are the kids that we refer to as having dysgraphia, where their writing is difficult to read and it can lead to spelling problems. Your teacher may come to you with concerns about your child's learning or attention. Obviously, school performance problems, report cards showing lower than expected performance, large number of missing assignments, those sorts of problems. And then difficulty expressing thoughts orally or in written form, and then problems understanding concepts in school. So then we have behavioral indicators like acting out without really thinking. Those are impulsive behaviors. Maybe it could be manifest as speaking out of turn in class or problems on the playground, acting out in school or social situations, behavioral problems, being the class clown, and it could be also difficulties with relating with your peers. So that would manifest as weak social skills. And then poor emotional regulation. Is your child getting frustrated a lot with learning? Are they tearful? Is there anxiety? Are they resisting going to school or telling you they don't like school? Those can also be signs to consider. Now, none of these in isolation would necessarily mean you have to have an evaluation, but that's where we'll talk about in a few minutes about consultations and how they can be helpful in making the decision for you. But before we talk about that, I want to talk to you about the kinds of learning disorders or diagnoses that we see in our practice that affect school performance. So one obviously is dyslexia, and that can affect reading and writing. Dysgraphia affects writing, particularly the quality of penmanship. often it leads to a minimalistic writing style. So your student may be a great storyteller, but when you ask them to put it down on paper, suddenly it becomes a 2 or 3 sentence story. Dyscalculia is sort of a more complicated way of a math disorder. Those are generally, dyscalculia are students who have trouble with math concepts. Sometimes other aspects of math problems like difficulty with retrieving math facts or sign confusion can be a sign of other things like ADHD. And of course, ADHD is a very common presenting concern, and it's associated with executive functioning weaknesses. And for those of you who don't know about executive functioning, just collectively, they're higher order processing skills that become more important as we head through school, especially middle school and high school. So it can range from impulse control to emotional control to time management, flexible thinking, planning, organization, those kinds of things. And then processing disorders. Some students have auditory processing disorders, visual processing disorders. Some students have real problems with speed. There's some literature of a new diagnosis that they're considering. In the ADHD literature, some people refer to it as a concentration deficit disorder. Researchers refer to it as sluggish cognitive tempo. And those are students who have very slow processing speed. And they can look like they have ADHD, but it's more of a speed issue. And then, of course, we see a fair number of students who have executive functioning weaknesses. Now, that in and of itself is not a diagnosis, but it can affect school performance. We also have autism spectrum disorder, and often in school we see challenges with executive functioning and social skills. And then mental health diagnoses, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. We'll also see separation anxiety, it can be a wide range of diagnoses. And then speech and language problems, receptive language, expressive language, articulation. Students with articulation can sometimes have challenges with reading because they're not hearing the sounds correctly. If your child can't say, let's say, an R sound, then of course they're going to read it in a different way than what's typical. So that's why schools often do articulation work in students in young grades, in early grades, so it doesn't affect their reading. So now it's like, when should you seek consultation about your concerns? So, the first thing, of course, I would recommend is talk to your teacher, your child's teacher, and see what he or she says to you about how your child is performing relative to peers, if they see any areas that are hurdles for them in learning, also attention and focus. The one thing to keep in mind is that public school teachers may be reluctant to recommend an evaluation. Partly it's because if a public teacher recommends an evaluation, it then puts pressure on the school district to do the evaluation. So I've had a lot of parents coming in for consultations with me who say that the teacher said, privately, off the record, that they would recommend an evaluation. But private school teachers aren't under that kind of pressure. So obviously teachers can be the very first line of consultation. You can also talk to your child's pediatrician, especially around concerns about ADHD or mental health. I've had a number of students who saw their pediatrician. Pediatrician had them and the parents fill out quick rating scales or have private conversations with the students about their mood or anxiety. And then almost inevitably, the pediatrician will refer them for testing or further evaluation, especially if there's a mental health issue. And that's where you can then consult with an educational specialist or a clinical psychologist who specializes in assessments. So educational specialists are appropriate for consultations around academic related issues like dyslexia, dysgraphia, writing disorders, math disorders. Clinical psychologists can also be used for consultation around academic performance issues, but then also behavioral, attention, mental health issues as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about the consultation, what happens in a few minutes. And then I never underestimate parents' gut feeling about that something is not working or something is wrong with your child's learning or focus or behavior. And often that's based on family history. If you have older children, how does your child compare to older children? Do they learn to read, your older children learn to read much faster, or behaviorally they act very different? Or, does these problems sort of remind you of things you struggled with in school as well? So then what happens in a consultation? So if someone comes in to see me for a consultation, and often we book that as the first part of an evaluation. So we just book a consultation, and a determination is made during the consultation that an evaluation is warranted. So what we typically do in a consultation is we review current concerns. So what's been going on, like if you would come in today to see me, I would want to know how the school year has been for your child since September, what the strengths are, weaknesses. We also look at, issues in school and out of school. Then we review history, and we start from basically birth to now. So we'll review early family history, early developmental history to see if perhaps there were any problems during pregnancy or during early medical history, such as seizures or those kinds of concerns. Then we'll review family history. So we'll ask, even if in many of our families, because of generational issues, we have family members who had learning problems but weren't diagnosed with learning disability. So I remember when I was in elementary school, I went to a parochial school, and we had a family that had 12 children in the family. And every year, one of those students was being held back because of learning issues, and they were sort of seen as kind of slow learners. And it turns out that I met up with one of those family members who was a classmate with me for about 4 years when I went back to my hometown. And when he heard what I was doing, he told me that all four of his children have been diagnosed with dyslexia. So it's likely that he and his siblings had dyslexia, but back in the 60s and 70s when we were in school, it wasn't really recognized. So we want to look at either diagnosed issues or undiagnosed. And they could include, student family members who dropped out of school. And then for mental health issues, if we don't necessarily remember a family member being depressed or anxious, we look for things like, was there a loner, a family member that didn't like to leave the house, substance abuse issues, those kinds of things. And then we also want to talk about any interventions you attempted in the past. So often parents have tried working with their students. Sometimes they've tried tutoring. And sometimes they were like in a reading recovery group at school, which isn't really special education. It's just designed for kids who may be slower to learn to read. And then we like to look at collateral information like report cards, schoolwork. A lot of parents will bring in worksheets or copies of written work so that we can see, for example, penmanship, how ideas are expressed in written form, those sorts of things. And, we ask questions like, does your child like to read for pleasure? Many of the kids that we see who have attention deficit or dyslexia do not read for pleasure, or if they do read, they may read like anime or picture books or magazines rather than traditional novels. So then your job is to determine when to seek an evaluation. So after your consultation and your discussion with the professional, you may think, you may get the recommendation, let's hold off for a little bit, try these things and then come back, or you feel like it's going to be helpful to have an evaluation. So that would be your first kind of launch toward an evaluation. If your child is in distress, with typical comments we hear from parents is kids saying, I'm stupid, they start resisting school, they tantrum around homework, talk about I hate school. It shows that your child is stressed by school. And so you want to make sure to figure out what's going on with that. Because one of the things, as we know, kids have a long history of ahead of them, or a long road of education ahead of them. And you don't want them to start hating school as early as elementary school. And so it then has ripple effects in middle school and high school performance. You can also seek the evaluation any time of the year. A lot of parents come in the summer because it's easy to schedule, and then they have the reports ready in September when the new school year starts. I will tell you that usually schools don't want to see the reports during the first few weeks of the school year because, of course, it's busy for them, plus you have new teachers. So generally, they'll look at reports and consider any follow-up services about a month into the school year after the teachers have gotten to know your student. But we have a lot of students who come in anytime during the school year. For younger kids, we recommend testing earlier in the morning, earlier in the day, so they're not overly fatigued. Morrissey Compton, for one, we're open on Saturdays. So we have some of our clinicians who work on Saturdays and can test kids so they don't miss school. Often parents say to us, well, I don't want to pull my child out of school because they're having so many challenges. But the reality is that if they're having a lot of challenges, they're probably really not benefiting from school. And if you can get in faster by pulling a child from school, then you might be able to make headway faster that way. And then some parents just want to rule out that there aren't any learning problems, that they suspect something's going on, and that there won't be. They want to make sure that they haven't missed something. So we'll talk a little bit about who should perform the evaluation. So there are a number of places in the Bay Area that do multidisciplinary assessments. For example, Morrissey Compton or the Children's Health Council. There are other clinics around the area. And multidisciplinary evaluations generally mean that there's more than one professional involved in the evaluation. For the typical kind of learning disability ADHD evaluation, usually we have two professionals involved, a child psychologist and an educational specialist. And the advantage of that is that each of those professionals bring their expertise to the evaluation. So, for example, our educational specialists at Morrissey Compton are all credentialed educational therapists or have taught in schools, either special education or regular education. So they're well versed in strategies, techniques, interventions. And then the child psychologists are obviously well trained when it comes to things like executive functioning, processing skills, attention, and mental health issues. So you're bringing two people with these expertise to really look at your child. So it's kind of a team effect. And if your child also has speech and language concerns or some kind of language-based weakness, we would bring in a speech and language person at Morrissey Compton to add that component to the evaluation. All of our assessments that we do are developed based on the child's needs. So we can do focused evaluations, like some parents come in and they really just want to look at reading. Does this look like dyslexia? That often happens with younger kids. So they may just see an educational specialist for a reading evaluation. And then that educational specialist may recommend additional testing if it does appear like it looks like dyslexia or some other kind of learning issue. And then we can go to comprehensive evaluations. The typical psychoeducational evaluation involves a 1 hour intake, 4 hours of psychological testing, and 3 hours of educational testing. And then 1.5 hour parent conference, and then we meet usually depending on the age with the student after the evaluation and give them kind of a more summary version of the results. And that type of evaluations used for students where you're concerned about attention deficit disorder, learning disabilities, or a combination of the two, because often we see students with both of those conditions. And then if you have mental health concerns, we always screen for mental health issues in what we refer to as our extended evaluation. But if you have definite mental health concerns, the psychologist moves from 4 hours of testing to 6 hours of testing, and the remaining 2 hours is done for psychological testing. So you get expertise in these multidisciplinary assessments. One of the downsides of them is that you do have to pay out of pocket, at least upfront. We do provide families with invoices with all the procedure codes and diagnostic codes, but most insurance plans don't cover the entire cost of the evaluation. Particularly, they usually don't cover educational testing. So you'll get a partial reimbursement. And if you decide to use the evaluation to get services through your local public school, the school district may still require that they do some testing. And we'll talk a little bit more about why they would want to do it for an IEP or an accommodation plan. Part of it is they want to ensure that they get similar results. But there are many school districts, because we've been in operation since 1982, and for example, the Children's Health Council, that's been in operation even longer, some school districts just accept our evaluation because they have history with us and feel like we do a quality job. So you can also ask for an evaluation through the school. And the process there is that we strongly recommend and really tell you to put your request in writing, because if you just ask for an evaluation orally, we see a lot of parents get pushback, especially if students are earning pretty good grades or aren't a behavior problem. The school may say, well, they don't need to be tested because they're doing too well. If you put it in writing, it then locks the school district into a certain process where they have to do some testing. And so they have to develop an assessment plan within 15 days and then finish the testing within 4 to 5 days after that. And those are based on school days. So if you're dealing with like the winter holiday or spring break, those don't count. But even when you put it in writing, you may get some pushback. But when you put it in writing, they're required to do the evaluation. Now, almost inevitably, their evaluations are not comprehensive. So if you're looking at, for example, dyslexia, they'll do a reading evaluation, but they won't do additional processing tests that may not be directly related to dyslexia. So if you have broader educational or attention concerns, they will focus in on what they feel is the important part of the evaluation. So, and then some students don't like being taken from class for testing For some kids, they feel like it's embarrassing for them. So students don't like that. And then school districts do not assess for ADHD. They may note that the student appears to have symptoms of ADHD, but then they recommend going elsewhere for the formal diagnosis. Now, we have a lot of parents who have, the biggest issue with going to the school is it saves you money because it's a free service. And we have a lot of parents who will go and get a school evaluation and then bring that evaluation to us to look at and for advice whether we should do additional testing, or, for example, they need ADHD assessment. So they bring all the testing that the school district did. We won't repeat the testing because those tests are administered in standard procedures. So if they've had, for example, IQ testing done through the school district, we'll accept those results as part of our evaluation. So the cost of our evaluation is less. Then there are a lot of people out in their private practice, educational specialists or clinical psychologists who can also do the evaluation. Often their prices are lower. Once again, you'd have to pay up front though. I don't know of a single person, educational specialist or clinical psychologist in private practice that bills insurance, but they would provide you with an invoice once again with all the codes and procedures. The disadvantage is you only have one professional involved in the assessment, and the reality is that most educational specialists don't have training in mental health, and many psychologists do not have specific special education training or experience, so you're losing out a little bit on that multidisciplinary aspect. Although there are psychologists in the community that may have been a special education teacher early on, so they would have the qualifications and then they re-specialize in psychology. But it's always, I think from my perspective, it's always better to have multiple opinions that are integrated into understanding what's going on with your child. So we often parents ask us, how do you prepare the child for testing? We don't really want to make a big deal out of it, so it raises their child's anxiety. We also recommend that you reference previous conversations with your child, like if you've had a lot of problems around homework or if they've talked negatively about school, you can say, how you've talked about how you don't like to go to school and reading is hard. We're going to go through these kinds of activities to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, so we can figure out how to make learning easier for you, or school can be easier. We avoid using the term intelligence testing or learning disability. So even if we're doing an IQ test with the child, we do not refer to it as an IQ test. That can sometimes, provoke an emotional reaction, anxiety in students. And we don't want for them to assume that we're assuming they have some kind of a learning disability. If we talk to the students about it, we talk about that they learn differently rather than that it's a disability. And in my history of working with kids of all ages, many of them find the experience fun or have neutral feelings about the testing experience. I've only had a couple of students who really did not like it and didn't want to come back, or I had to go out to the parking lot and encourage them to get out of the car. But I've been doing it, as I said, for 30 years, and I can't even think about how many kids I've tested. It's only happened about 2 times or 3 times. I also encourage parents that the students have a good sleep, especially if they're coming in on Saturday. So no sleepovers the night before, because often kids are pretty tired then. And we avoid testing if the child's not feeling well. So if they're sick or have a cold. So the typical evaluation plan, I'll kind of just go through this quickly. You can refer back to it. We talk about the intake. Testing, if you're coming in for our full evaluations at Morrissey Compton, you'll have cognitive testing, which includes IQ testing and processing skills. And those are things like memory, attention, speed of processing, retrieval. We do educational testing in reading, writing, and math. We have students, parents, and teachers complete symptom checklists, and that part of that is screening for mental health issues or also to help us diagnose problems with executive functioning or ADHD. Mental health testing, we add that if there are specific concerns around depression or anxiety, where we'll do projective storytelling tests. Some of us do the inkblot test, we'll do personality testing. And then we might do developmental testing. So that's added if there are concerns around autism spectrum. It's usually performed by a clinical psychologist. And then there could be other areas, speech and language, occupational therapy, functional behavioral assessment, where a child's behavior is evaluated at school. And then depending on parents and the age of the child, we recommend a school observation. Some parents don't want the school to know their child's being tested, so they resist that. But especially for younger kids, and if there are behavioral concerns around ADHD or mental health, we encourage that to happen. So the typical evaluation plan is, you will continue with the parent conference. We review the results and discuss a plan for follow-up services and support. We'll meet with the student depending on the age and their willingness to attend. We encourage students from, let's say, middle school on up to come in, but we've had 9-year-old, 10-year-olds coming in, where we provide them a strength-based summary of results. So we tell them what they're doing well and how to use those strengths to help with areas that are weaker. And then we recommend follow-up services. That could be tutoring, it could be consultations about school, or talk about services directly at the school. So we also recommend that you share the evaluation results with teachers so that they have an understanding of what's going on with the student. And if you want to pursue services at the school, then they'll develop a team to look at the evaluation. And so the first question for you to ask is, do you want special education support, which means that the child would receive direct intervention services. Usually it's pull-out services in reading, writing, math. And to get those services, you'd have to request an IEP, or an individualized educational plan. And that's a whole separate talk. And PHP has lots of information about IEP, so you can research IEPs through their information. Or do you want just accommodations but no special education support? Like, does your child need extra time on tests, preferential seating at the front of the class, maybe using audiobooks if they're a slow reading rate? They can get what's called a 504 plan in public school, or an accommodation plan in private school. So all schools will do an accommodation plan. They're called they're somewhat different in name, depending on if you're a public or private school. And then we also help arrange for services. So that could be tutoring, educational therapy. We distinguish educational therapy from tutoring, where tutoring may be like homework help. Educational therapy is more remediation, like for a child who may have dyslexia or a writing disorder, math disorder. Executive functioning coaching, that's when you're teaching students, organizational skills, time management, how to be flexible in thinking, those kinds of things. Social skills groups for students who have social issues, mental health services, and medication services for students where parents feel like they want to consider medication for ADHD or mental health issues. And then finally, does your student need a reevaluation? Most students who are diagnosed with some kind of a learning disorder, ADHD, and are receiving accommodations at school or special education services are generally retested every 3 years. And this allows for the services or accommodations to continue. If you're getting special education services through an IEP at the school will do an evaluation every 3 years. It's called a triennial evaluation. If you're just getting a 504 plan or accommodations at a private school, often parents will come to a place like Morrissey Compton to get the reevaluation because you have to reapply for accommodations, particularly as students are heading to high school where they might need extra time or accommodations for the SAT and ACT. And having a track record of having accommodations and a 504 plan or accommodation plan makes the whole process of accommodations for the SAT and ACT easier. And then some parents decide that they'll have partial reevaluations like a year later to assess progress associated with like a intervention around, for example, dyslexia. They'll ask just to have reading reevaluated. And then for those students who really don't have any significant findings other than some executive functioning or some mild processing issues, they don't necessarily have to be reevaluated unless you're getting accommodations at the school. So that's the end of my talk. And so I have time for questions. And I'll start with first question.
Okay, I'm back. So John, thank you very much. That was a ton of information, but everybody hung in there. So let me just start with some of the questions. Okay, how much does a private evaluation cost?
The private evaluation, of course, a little bit of the cost depends on what kind of an evaluation you're getting. But I would say that the range is typically in this area about $4,000 to $6,000. So the $4,000, that sort of range closer to $4,000 is usually if you're getting a basic evaluation, like for a young child who might be coming in at 7 for a dyslexia evaluation and may just see a psychologist once. Or let's say you're just looking at ADHD as an issue, but then it gets to $5,000 and $6,000 if you're adding the processing tests and mental health testing.
Okay, thank you. I've heard the term neuropsych evaluation. What is that?
So neuropsych evaluations are evaluations that are similar to the kinds of psychoeducational testing I talked about earlier. And it's usually done by a neuropsychologist who will, by themselves, as a single person, look at educational and psychological factors with your child. Now, a lot of people feel like they need a neuropsychological evaluation for their child because that's sort of what people talk about. And I feel as a psychologist that neuropsych evaluations are important for students when you have concerns about medical issues, maybe if there's a history of seizure disorders, if there's a syndrome, a really complicated learning disorder child with complicated needs or autism, that the neuropsychologist brings expertise from anatomy and understanding biology and the impact it has. But if your child is just dealing with dyslexia or ADHD, then you can go to someone who's not a neuropsychologist. You don't need to have a neuropsychological evaluation. The neuropsychologists tend to book out further in advance, so some of them you have to wait 6 months to get in, and they usually cost more as well. And many times you'll get a 50-page report, and then parents will come to us and say, help us understand this. So, and if you come to us and we do a consultation and we feel like this is really more of a case for a neuropsychologist, we will tell you that we make the referral. We would give you names of people who could help you with that.
Great. ADHD. So there's a couple questions. ADHD seems to be such a common diagnosis. Is it overdiagnosed, particularly in young boys?
I think we always have to be cautious about ADHD because I think part of what we're seeing is perhaps an adaptation in our younger population where kids are just not being able to pay attention as well as they did. For example, when I was in elementary school, for example, I see it in the lobby at our clinic, where kids need to have some stimulation while they're sitting there. They can't just sit there. Rarely do I see them looking at books, even though we have lots of like picture books for kids to look at. They're usually on a phone playing a game. And I think it creates a momentum where kids feel like they need to be stimulated a lot. Now, if you go through an evaluation and you're getting testing done and you're looking at multiple sources, then you can be reasonably assured that the ADHD evaluation has been done carefully. So according to the diagnosis, the symptoms have to have appeared before the age of 12, although we do see some kids who are very smart and inattentive who mask the symptoms, especially at school, because they warrant a behavioral problem. Secondly, you need to see the problems in a cross setting. So we usually ask for teacher reports, parent, and then we'll even ask coaches, tutors, music teachers, because sometimes teachers don't recognize, especially if the student's in public school and they're in a class with 30 students and they're quiet and inattentive, they're not showing up on the teacher's radars. And then we look for a profile among the tests so that we see a certain profile associated with ADHD. In those cases, you can be assured that you've gotten an accurate diagnosis. A lot of people, though, go online, fill out a checklist, or maybe talk to a doctor and they work on a checklist. Some doctors may not even see the child himself or herself and then make the diagnosis. In those cases, it's better to get a second opinion.
Okay, so second part of that question is, who would you suggest to have to evaluate a child with ADHD?
Yeah. So I think what most parents do, the first line is usually they talk to the child's pediatrician. And that's simply because the pediatrician knows medical history. So for example, if the child has had some kind of medical interventions, for example, we see kids that might have gone through chemotherapy or cancer treatment, or are being treated with certain medications for asthma or others, that can create attention problems. So they'll know the medical history. They can also then interview the child and the parents. But for example, a lot of parents will go to their pediatricians, like at Palo Medical Foundation, and then they refer them to us for further testing. So they kind of do an initial screening. But for the testing, you can come to a center like Morrissey Compton, or you can go to a private practitioner, clinical psychologist who specializes in assessments. There are some psychologists who do not do assessment or testing, they only do therapy. And usually you can get that information from a website, or what most parents do is the pediatricians will make a referral and then they'll contact that referral.
Great. We also have a great resource directory on the PHP website. So
Okay,
check that
great.
out too. So I had a couple of questions that I think were actually answered. One was about the school's obligation to test the child. So I think you covered that.
Yeah.
If the person that asked that needs more information, you can call in here to PHP. That's the kind of question we deal with all the time. And what the next step an expectation would be once they get the evaluation. You might want to just touch on
Sure.
that.
So what happens often with the results of the evaluation is you'll revert the team that's been involved in the assessment will review the results
At the school.
at the school. They'll have a school meeting, and it usually has a principal or some administrator, the school psychologist, the student's teacher, and a resource person, and they review the results. And I've been in meetings where some schools have found problems, like they'll say, yes, your child has dyslexia, but because they're performing okay in the classroom, they don't get qualified for special education services. And so often parents will come for us then for resources to get private tutoring. And unless if there's a financial issue, it makes sense to try and get services through the school. But I've also found that students often make more progress working with someone privately because they're working one-on-one. There are very clear research-based methodologies that have been designed to help students with reading or math, and you can find professionals in the community who have that training. Often resource specialists at the school will mix different approaches because they have a group of kids who have different needs, and that tends to water down the effectiveness of the intervention.
Okay. Last question. Can you talk about a 529 plan? I think they made 504 plan.
Mhm.
What would a 504 plan look like for dyslexia?
So the 504 plan was the accommodation plan I talked about. And so what they might do with someone who has dyslexia and the processing issues associated with dyslexia, the 504 plan would allow perhaps for the student to be closer to the teacher so that the teacher can do check-ins to make sure that the child understands what's happening, the directions that he or she gave. They may qualify for audiobooks or ebooks, and so they get their textbooks as ebooks. And they may modify reading assignments so that, if a teacher recommends, let's say, 20 minutes a night of reading, what they'll encourage parents to do is maybe do synchronized reading, where a parent reads one page, child reads one page, or the parent reads the page and the child reads the page. But they're not expected to go through as much reading as that. And then sometimes with dyslexia, they need a reader, someone to read test questions to them, and so what happens is a teacher's aide will read the question, especially like people don't think about math and the language part of math, which is word problems. And so often, not often, but sometimes kids with dyslexia who have more severe dyslexia will get a reader for tests.
Or maybe extra
And
time?
extra time
Yeah.
because they usually read a little bit slower. And, if they're in early elementary school, extra time probably doesn't matter much, but they will get extra time on standardized tests like ERBs or whatever tests the school uses.
Great. Well, John, thank you. That was so much information. Just in closing, let me say if you have additional questions, you can certainly call in here to PHP. We have education specialists that are available every day, Monday through Friday. If you're new to special education in this whole process, we have a monthly class called Special Education Basics. It's about a 3-hour class that walks you through the basics, and it's really helpful to know because it will probably open up a whole bunch more questions of things that you're going to want to know about and talk to staff about. So please also check our e-learning section on our website, where we have a lot of videos and things you can inform yourself. We've curated things from the web that are the sort of best of information that you may be looking for. So John, why don't you just wrap up about Morrissey
Yeah,
Compton?
and feel free to contact us at Morrissey Compton. I'm happy to meet with anyone who's interested for a consultation. We have a staff of about 30 people, so with different expertise, so we can match up your concerns. I also want to tell people Morrissey Compton is a nonprofit organization, so we offer scholarship and financial aid. And given the Bay Area, there are a lot of middle-class families that are getting financial aid from us because of the expense of living here. So if you can't afford our services, you can apply for financial assistance for that as well.
That's excellent, and that's one of the reasons we're partnering with Morrissey Compton is because of that nonprofit.
Yeah, we also just do a free parent education. So if you live in the Mid-Peninsula area, you can look at our website. Usually in February and March, we do like a 4 or 5 week series on ADHD, where parents can meet for 4 or 5 Saturdays, and they talk about from suspicions of ADHD to how to ask for the right services in an IEP. So the person, Dr. Defoe, who's an expert in ADHD, kind of walks parents through from beginning to end. And it's usually really well attended and popular.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for attending our first in a series. The next one will be happening in February, and it's going to be a follow-up to this, and it'll be about, okay, you've had your assessments, you've got these reports, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. What do what does it mean? What do you do with it? And that will be coming in February. So check the PHP or the Morrissey Compton websites. We'll have the date posted there. All right. Thanks everybody
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Take care.